if I might, I'm going to take us back to one of the more technical aspects of politics, our electoral systems. People like me are usually only allowed out on election day, so it is a great pleasure to be here. At their core, electoral systems convert votes cast at elections into seats in Parliament. And this is the opening statement of nearly every book that's ever been written about electoral systems. But of course, we know that electoral systems do very much more than that technical function. Michael Gallagher and Paul Mitchell described the electoral system as the crucial link in the chain of representative democracy. And Pippa Norris has said that it is one of the most enduring decisions that a state can actually make about its political systems. Both statements, I think, have particular relevance for what happened on the island of Ireland. Proportional representation by the single transferable vote, which I should probably say at this stage is rather an obscure global electoral system, was the electoral system chosen for elections north and south at the foundation of the two separate political jurisdictions. Within a short number of years, PRSTV was rejected for use in Northern Ireland and replaced with first past the post, a majoritarian system, while PRSTV has actually become one of the defining institutions of politics in the Free State, later the Republic of Ireland. Importantly, the two systems in operation, PR and first past the post, have very different logics, principles and objectives. But interestingly, they yielded quite similar types of politics, majoritarianism-infused politics in both parts of the island in the early decades. But ultimately, these would change quite noticeably as the decades progressed. As society changed and political conditions evolved, PRSTV in the Republic proved itself an electoral formula that could reflect change, while first past the post in Northern Ireland often amplified underpinning divisions. The vibrant field of electoral scholarship has demonstrated concretely that the different families of electoral systems generate notable and variable outcomes, as happened on the island of Ireland. The electoral system adopted can impact upon which citizens are represented and to what extent, the composition of the party system, the common form of government in the state, and indeed government durability itself. Matt Shugart has also described how electoral system choice impacts on the broader concerns of politics, such as regime stability, democratic quality, and management of ethnic conflict. But indeed, it has also been shown that political context systematically shapes the effects of electoral systems. And it is useful to unpack some of these points in a short review of electoral politics in Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. As early as the 19th century, it was understood that proportional systems generated more equal representation, giving a closer relationships between the votes cast for a party and the number of seats it received in Parliament. But the accepted downside of that was also recognised, and that was in the form of more what was then considered to be unstable government, coalition government. Of course, we have revised these views somewhat in recent decades. Majoritarian systems provided a more imperfect relationship between votes cast and seats won, but it provided enduring and stable government as the early theory went. These central propositions were formalised into theoretical models in the 1950s by the French political scientist Maurice Duverger. Duverger classified party and government consequences as the mechanical effects of electoral system choice, but he also elaborated on the psychological effects of electoral system choice, and these were the ways in which both voters and political parties reacted and changed their behaviour and fitted it to the type of system which was in place. And one of the kind of important ones here is the idea that party entry into the system is quite difficult in a majoritarian system, and that creates all kinds of disincentives for people to set up political parties because their chances of success are so much the lesser. Now, these are not laws, as we might say in the natural world, but they're as close to laws of as we get in political science. So, for example, we know that the effective number of political parties in majoritarian systems is usually about 2, just over 2, whereas in PR systems it tends to trend closer to 4. Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State provide a fascinating comparative case study of the outcomes of different electoral systems in operation in neighbouring but substantially different polities. In the early decades, these two systems delivered unusually similar majoritarian politics with a small number of parties and single-party governments, but they tracked in very different directions as the decades passed. Coming to PR in Ireland, John Coakley in his many publications provided a valuable overview of the reasoning and decisions that led to the introduction of PRS-TV in Ireland. It was adopted first for selected constituencies under the Home Rule Act, for local elections in Sligo in 1918, and then latterly for the whole country. And of course it was chosen for parliamentary elections in the Northern and Southern Parliaments under the Government of Ireland Act in 1920. Interestingly, the selection of PRS-TV as the electoral system for Ireland was largely uncontroversial. Discussion of electoral reform had actually been quite widespread across Great Britain since the middle of the 19th century, and there were quite considerable concerns expressed about minority representation. But momentum for change actually also took hold in Ireland. An Irish branch of the Proportional Representation Society was established, and Basil Chubb has highlighted the attendance of Arthur Griffith at an early public lecture in 1911 as being decisive in shifting to Sinn Féin support in favour of the system. The representation of minority interests that was offered by PRS-TV persuaded Griffith that it could work effectively for the complex politics of early 20th century pre-independence Ireland. The widespread use of PR across new European democracies to deal with class, religious and linguistic cleavages, and the fact that it was not used in Britain were also cited as important indicators of why it was embraced by Sinn Féin. The only voices in opposition to PRS-TV came from the Ulster Unionist side, and their opposition was rooted in the view that it was un-British. Indeed, in 1885, I found a quote from Gladstone where he described STV as artificial, not known to our usages and history. There were strategic considerations at play in the thinking of British administration and its support for PRS-TV at elections in Ireland. It was persuaded that the system could deliver representation for the Protestant minority on the island, the Southern Unionist minority, and the Northern Unionist majority. Con O'Leary has argued that the outcomes of elections, specifically in the 1918 election, in which nationalists swept the board using first past the post, reinforced support for STV as an alternative because it could prevent the kind of electoral outcomes that had been achieved. He cites later newspaper coverage of the Sligo local elections that used PRS-TV and the fact that Sinn Féin was actually pushed into second place at those as important in persuading Southern Unionists that PR could protect their interests and deliver minority representation. The PR system also delivered representation for nationalists in local election districts in Northern Ireland, kind of further reinforcing that particular view. So British electoral reformers favoured PRS-TV. And there's also another important point, and one that we won't say much about today, and that is that it is a system that is considered to preserve the relationship or the link between voter and constituency representative in a way that other forms of PR do not, and one that was actually quite valued given the legacy of British elections and their intent and focuses. So with the British administration on side and tacit support from nationalists, PRS-TV emerged as the electoral system of choice for parliaments north and south. PR was included in the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 and was later transposed into the Free State Constitution. Several histories that address the choice of PRS-TV remarked that it was selected at the time because it was the only version of PR that was actually known to the people who were writing the treaties and the constitutions. I'm not entirely sure that that's fully borne out. Joly notes that there were concerns expressed during the writing of the Free State Constitution that PR might lead to an excessive form of multi-partyism and unstable government. And he goes on to provide, Joly goes on to provide a long quote from Ernest Blythe on a similar point. So whether they did or did not know that there were other forms of PR, the framers of the Free State Constitution and indeed of the preceding Anglo-Irish Treaty were aware of the potential implications of the choice of electoral systems, so the consequences were known and understood. The early PRSTV elections, especially in Southern Ireland, later the Free State, tell us very little about the system, and indeed that's somewhat true in Northern Ireland as well. Electoral pacts and uncontested seats delivered preordained outcomes, so it's difficult to infer very much from how they operated. The first, what we might today term a free and fair general election, was held in 1923. It used PR, which was mandated in the Free State Constitution, and the STV part actually only came along later in the Electoral Acts in 1923. The Dáil consisted of 153 TDs elected from 30 constituencies with district magnitudes, and that just means the number of parliamentarians to be elected from each constituency between 3 and 9. And district magnitude matters because in general we know that the higher the district magnitude, the more proportional the outcome of the election. So the closer the relationship between the votes cast for a political party and the number of seats that the party wins. And it's something that is kind of a persistent thread through analyses of elections later in the Republic of Ireland, because although we have a proportional system, we have tended to have district magnitudes that are somewhat lower than in other countries that use proportional representation. A minority single-party government was installed, albeit one that was able to act as though it had a majority because of anti-treaty Sinn Féin abstention. Several new and splinter parties formed in the ensuing years, reflecting one of Duverger's psychological effects that party entry is easier in a PR system. However, most failed to mount serious challenges at later elections and indeed faded from politics or were absorbed into existing parties. The first 1927 election substantially defined the party system in the Free State later Republic as we know it today, with Fianna Fáil's early performance setting the ground for its later dominance, and the second election resulted in many of the smaller parties losing their seats and they would not return to Parliament. The effective number of elective parties is a measure of political fragmentation, and this was above 4 until about the close of the 1920s. Now, this is a measure that covers the number of political parties, but also their relative size in Parliament. So it speaks to political fragmentation. New party entry was a feature of elections in the 1940s, but it was actually not again until the late 1990s that we were to return to fragmentation levels above 4. The Republic of Ireland had a 2.5-party system for most of the 20th century, an outcome that is generally more commonly associated with majoritarian electoral systems. There were periods of electoral change, but the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour core at the heart of politics usually reasserted itself. That is until the early 21st century, when we now say that politics is mean reverting no more, and indeed we look at a very different kind of party landscape. In many ways, the Free State provided a rare inversion of Maurice Duverger's propositions. It began with a multi-party system that Peter Mayer described as polarised pluralism. It drifted towards a 2.5-party system for much of its lifetime during the 20th century. And then by the 1990s, we see the seeds of a more fully fledged multi-party system starting to emerge in the system. No one form of government predominated, but single-party governments were a regular feature until 1989. And we often gloss over the detail of governments in the kind of early decades of the state, and we think about kind of perpetual Fianna Fáil government, but I think it's useful to remember that some of those governments were minority governments, not majority governments. So some elements of a majoritarianism infused politics, but it was not all pervasive. PRS-TV was designed into the politics of the Free State to provide representation for the minority Anglo-Irish community, and it did achieve that, at least for a time, through the university seats and the electoral rules. Joe Lee, though, notes with some irony that the first minority saved by PRS-TV were actually anti-treaty Sinn Féin, who would surely have been eliminated had First Past the Post been in use. Minority voices were accommodated within the politics of the Free State, but it indeed would be wrong to assess the Free State as a place where proportional representation delivered consensus politics and sensitivity to minority rights and needs. And we only need to look to Professor Erna Byrne's contribution to really reflect more on that. On balance, PRS-TV, operating in a largely homogenous polity, provided majoritarian form of politics. The dominant group was able to impose its values and preferences on the whole. The Anglo-Irish community did not organise effectively in politics. Some left, some were absorbed into other political movements, and their distinctive identity faded from politics over the decades. Furthermore, a reduction in the district magnitude in 1935 created a form of electoral threshold that kept political fragmentation lower than it might otherwise have been. Diarmaid Ferriter has also written about an inclination among politicians and political parties in the early decades of the state to diminish differences between themselves. Levels of electoral integrity in the Free State were moderate. Malapportionment was largely absent due to constitutional constraints, but bouts of gerrymandering were not unknown all the way up until the 1970s. Political context matters, and the electoral system for a long time delivered broadly proportional outcomes, reflecting the conservative, quite authoritarian, if stable orientation of the vast majority of the electorate in the Free State. Electoral engineers employed a different system and a different approach in Northern Ireland, one that also led to majoritarianism infusing elections, politics, and policy, but in a more comprehensive and indeed stifling way. Elections to the Northern Parliament, known as Stormont elections, were first held in 1921 using PRS-TV. Unionists won 40 of 52 seats in the Parliament, while the divided Nationalists picked up just 12 or 23% of the seats on more than 30% of the votes, giving a clearly disproportional outcome at the election. Disproportionality declined somewhat at the 1925 election, and the Ulster Unionist Party dropped to 62% of the seats on 55% of the votes. And many identify that loss in support as being very important in informing and shaping the decision that would see PRS-TV being rejected for parliamentary elections. PRS-TV was replaced with First Past the Post, first for local elections in 1923 and for parliamentary elections to Stormont in 1929. This change has been described as a flagrant abuse of power. First Past the Post is a majoritarian system, and it delivered extreme majoritarian outcomes in Northern Ireland. In the first election using First Past the Post, the UUP took 72% of the seats, with 51% of the vote. And it's widely argued that the decision to abolish PRS-TV served both partisan, but also importantly class interests in the unionist community. First Past the Post ensured a dominant two-party system and perpetual single-party UUP government, features that were not to be interrupted until 1972. John Coakley has been to the fore in demonstrating that the adoption of First Past the Post reinforced the bipolar character of the party system. And many have also emphasised that it diminished the risk of intra-block fragmentation. In addition to the choice of electoral system, the wider abuse of electoral laws, gerrymandering and malapportionment meant that elections in Northern Ireland for many decades had what we would today describe as quite low levels of electoral integrity. Indeed, this point was made by Professor O'Leary in his many works and also touched upon earlier today. And he has argued that although Northern Ireland had formal democratic rules, the operation of these rules in practice leads to very qualified assessments of the nature of early Northern Irish democracy. So in concluding, if I might return to the opening statement of Michael Gallagher and Paul Mitchell's definitive book on the topic of electoral systems, they open with the statement, "Electoral systems matter." They do indeed. And it is also true to say that their impacts and logics are mediated through political culture, the underpinning cleavages that shape politics, and also electoral laws. In Northern Ireland and the Free State, PRS-TV and First Past the Post facilitated the dominant community in imposing their will for many decades. Majoritarian spirit dominated in both jurisdictions. But one political system had legitimacy, the other did not. In Northern Ireland, a majoritarian electoral system was chosen specifically to limit minority representation and to shore up integration in one particular community. It was also combined with notable abuse of the principles and laws of electoral integrity. In the Free State, the much smaller minority community achieved political representation and voice, initially disproportionately larger than their electoral weight. The 1937 Constitution designed out some of that electoral advantage for the Anglo-Irish community, but their lack of political organisation also contributed to the diminution of their representation over time. As the decades progressed, PRS-TV delivered election outcomes with much lower levels of disproportionality than that of First Past the Post in Northern Ireland. And importantly, PRS-TV is widely supported by the electorate. Voters rebuffed proposals to change the system to First Past the Post in referendums in 1959 and 1966. The Fianna Fáil proposals were robustly opposed by all of the main opposition parties, who argued that the country would end up with perpetual Fianna Fáil government. Blay and Massicott described the PRS-TV system as giving maximum freedom to voters, freedom that voters in the Republic have refused to relinquish. Despite 2 referendums, several serious reports, and indeed a constitutional convention looking at the matter, there are no serious signs that voters can be persuaded to surrender the great electoral power that the system confers upon them. And of course, Northern Ireland has returned to PRS-TV, having sundered it some decades earlier. So historians and political scientists have tended to focus on different aspects of the impact of PRS-TV in the Free State, later Republic of Ireland. But there is widespread agreement that the electoral system choice was central to the enduring political stability that was achieved. But indeed, equally in Northern Ireland, there is general agreement that the majoritarian outcomes delivered by First Past the Post exacerbated embedded community division. Thank you.